Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think this is going to be a pretty interesting night. I'm Peter Martin. I'm the convener of the Southern Highlands Coal Action Group. I think most of you know me by now. Tonight we're really privileged to have someone who has lived through the, if you like, the third generation fossil fuel extraction boom in the United States, and almost just survived to tell the tale. John Fenton is known throughout the United States, sadly, because his valley in Pavilion, Wyoming has been trashed by the gas industry. And of course, Wyoming is known for oil and gas and also for coal. And as you all know, we're in the middle of a gas licence area that's massive here. Wherever there's coal, and we're in the middle of a coal licence down at Sutton Forest, there's a lot of water usually and a lot of methane. We're lucky to have someone like John who's willing to give up his time to come here and tell us some salutary lessons that they've learnt in the States, where this uncontrolled fossil fuel invasion is really going to play havoc with parts of the States in the next 30 to 50 years, and is already playing havoc with their water systems and the health of some of the communities and the environment. I met John first, Kim and I met John when we were over in the States in mid-2012, where we spent 5 weeks going around the gas fields in Colorado, Wyoming, Pennsylvania, Dakota, New York State and Texas. And that trip was fascinating but shocking and confronting, to think that a first world country could allow major multinational corporations tear up some of the most beautiful parts of the country and effectively destroy it and put people at serious risk. And that's what's happened. Of course, in the United States, it's all about energy independence. That's what the politicians claim. But, you know, in many regards, it's the same as here. It's about corporate greed. It's about getting the last drop of gas or oil out of the ground. It's about perpetuating giant multinationals. Most of the money, as we know in Australia, goes offshore. And funnily enough, it's the same story in the US, as John will tell you. So without saying anything more, the way it's going to work tonight, we have 2 theatres running, this one and number 4. John will talk here for basically the next 40 minutes, 35, 40 minutes, and show some really interesting slides. We'll then have question time. Then John and I move to the next theatre, and you will see the 2 Lock the Gate movies, one called Fractured Country and one called Undermining Australia. And Fractured Country is clearly about the gas industry that's come here with a vengeance, telling the same stories that they told in the US 20 years ago about how good it's going to be, and one's about the damage that the coal mining industry has been doing and is doing to Australia and our heritage right now. And, you know, it's no different to what's happened in John's home state of Wyoming. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce John Fenton.
Good evening. Thank you for letting me speak with you this evening. And we're really here to talk about a number of things. We're here to talk about extractive industries. Some of them have existed for over 100 years. In Wyoming, the first oil well was drilled in the late 1890s. So we've had conventional oil and gas in Wyoming for a long time. We've also had coal mining, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with here in Australia. Open pit mining, some of the biggest in North America. We're the largest supplier of coal in the United States. Very often has the same effects of what we're going to talk about tonight. The coal mines strip the aquifers out. The air quality is ruined because of the coal dust and the explosive dust. We also have in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, a lot of those places, the longwall coal mining, where very often they mine underneath the aquifers. The coal's mined out, the ground's allowed to collapse and subside, creating a giant void for the aquifers to run into. Can have impacts over hundreds of square kilometers or miles. But what we deal with in Wyoming, in my part of Wyoming, is unconventional gas. So I wanted to familiarize you a little bit with the United States and where I'm at, because I've always kind of known the shape of Australia as a whole, but until I've had the honor of traveling around this country, I really didn't know much about the states or where they were located. So as you can see up here, the state of Wyoming, we live just to the left and center of the W. We live at about a 5,700 foot elevation, about 25 miles east of the Rocky Mountains, and the highest peak in Wyoming, Gannett Peak's 14,000 feet. We used to receive a foot to a foot and a half of moisture a year, combined rain and snowfall. We're now down to about 6 to 12 inches a year. Our hay, our barley, the major crops that we raise in our area are actually watered from snowmelt runoff that's gathered in reservoirs and distributed through canals. So we have 1,000 acres. Of that, about 220 acres is in agricultural production. Very high producing though. We have ideal climate. We have water that's brought in via the canals. It's not uncommon to have anywhere from 3 to 6 tons per acre of hay put up off of this ground. Very fertile. But much of the country you see up here, most of Texas, this area, has the Barnett Shale and the Eagle Ford Shale. Pennsylvania is now suffering the wrath of the Marcellus Shale. Massive, beautiful, forested state of Pennsylvania is now bisected by hundreds of pipelines, roads, drill pads, open storage pits for fracking fluid and produced water. North Dakota is in the middle of an oil boom. We even have, as you can see in California, there's a large green valley that runs through 2/3 of the central part of California. In fact, it's called the Central Valley. Produces 90% of the fresh produce for the United States. Overlies the San Andreas Fault. It also overlies the Monterey Shale. And there is a proposal to drill 20,000 unconventional fracked oil and gas wells into the Monterey Shale. So I'm here to tell you that no matter where you live, whether it be desert like myself or a beautiful highlands like you have around here or the Central Valley of California, this is no hindrance or even any sort of speed bump for these type of industries. They will absolutely go anywhere. So I would like to tell you my experiences. I'm not here to tell you what to think, but I hope that you will take into account what we've been through and use that in the decisions that you make going forward. Next slide, please. So this is where we live. This is just north of our house, a couple miles. This is really wide open, free country. This is kind of what you think of, or I think of anyways, as the West. When you see a cowboy movie in the black and whites or any of those, this is it. You can go out here and not see another human being. You can really go where it's wild yet. The very distance you see the Owl Creek Mountains. They're part of the Rocky Mountains. Very, very beautiful country. We also have a lot of wildlife yet. We have large herds of mustangs, as you can see up in the right-hand corner here. Some of them probably descendant from the conquistador horses that were turned loose by some of the first Europeans that actually explored the interior of the North America. We also have large populations of pronghorn antelope, mule deer, elk. Elk is like a deer the size of a horse. Mountain lions, bobcats, grizzly bears, you name it, we've got it. It's an extraordinary place to really kind of get an idea of what much of North America may have been like before European settlers came in and really changed it. We also have a very rich cultural history. We actually live right in the middle of the Shoshone and Arapaho Indian Reservation. It's called the Wind River Indian Reservation. These petroglyphs, a Crow petroglyph on the right, a Shoshone petroglyph on the left, are just a couple hundred meters from our home. This is shows that there's been a connection to the land here for hundreds of years. You can actually stand in front of this one. It's eye level. You actually stand in the very place that the man or woman stood who created this and took the time. This thing is probably this wide and half as tall as I am. It wasn't something that somebody casually came along and did. It meant something. This was a place that supported life. Above our home, we actually had what we call teepee rings. The Native Americans used on the plains a cone-shaped tent with lodgepole pines and hides that covered it, and around the base they would stack stones to help anchor the base of the teepee, but it also marked camping areas that they used as they traveled around in their nomadic lifestyle. And those were one of the first pieces of collateral damage as we saw this industry move into our area. In the preparation of drill pads, these were dozed to the side. And so a part of the history, a part of the culture of the people there, and something that we valued as a connection to the past and a remembrance that it's our time now to be stewards of this land, has been pushed away by a piece of heavy equipment. And it takes some of that specialness that we felt away from the land. I wanted to show you, this is when we're cutting hay. Back up behind the oil tanks is where the petroglyphs are. So this is what we do to make a living and to feed the beef cows that are now running. It's our winter. We have 150 head of bred Angus cows that are on the place. So the hay that we raise is fed to the cattle right back on the place. The manure is worked back into the soil. This has allowed us to actually farm without chemical fertilizers. We've tried to run the land the way that it would be if we weren't there, if animals naturally habitated it, lived on it. Excuse me. And it's been very successful. This is looking from our house, from the porch of our house. Just baled hay the night before. I thought it was an interesting perspective. What I was actually trying to get was right out here in the middle is a pronghorn antelope. That's kind of a rarity for our area. They're within a few miles of us, but they rarely come into the hay fields. But what struck me after I looked at this slide a few times is you can see all the white specks in the background. Those are oil and gas locations. So that was one of the first victims or the first casualties of this unconventional oil and gas. Because with conventional oil and gas, a lot of times you have a giant reservoir underground. You drill a well bore down. We have conventional wells in Wyoming that are nearing 100 years old and still producing. With unconventional, whether that be coal bed methane, we call it coal bed methane, you refer to it as coal seam gas, tight sands gas, which is what we have here, or shale gas, it requires a much larger footprint. There's not a giant reservoir underground. They're actually removing the product from the pores of the stone or the shale or the coal that exists underneath, so they have to drill a lot more wells. It has a marked difference on the landscape as compared to the old style of conventional oil and gas. So this is our home. We're still under construction. My sons and I have built this house ourselves, every piece of it. So this is what it was like when, in the late 1990s, I have to tell you, they drilled the first well here in 1964. But because they were drilling into these tight sand pockets, the gas wouldn't come. The wells would barely make gas. They never paid for themselves. So between 1964 and the mid to late 90s, we had 24 wells in the area. In the late 1990s, mid 1990s, they perfected in the Barnett Shale of Texas, which is around the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the procedure of modern, high-volume, slick-water hydraulic fracturing. Allowed them to go in and crack these formations open, prop those cracks open with sand usually, and extract the mineral from the stone itself. So they came to us and said, we're going to drill these wells. And there was nothing we could do about it because we don't own the mineral rights. It's much the way I've heard it works here in Australia. We don't own the mineral rights. The leaseholder on those mineral rights, their right to extract that mineral supersedes our right on the surface. So they came to us and said, this is what we're going to do. But don't worry, because it's pretty much like what we've done in the past. We've just got some modern techniques that allow us to make it more efficient, to draw the energy out of the ground. So we thought, well, you know, we've lived with this for a long time in Wyoming. Our state government says they've got laws to handle this, that they're going to police this and watch out. We didn't really put up a struggle. We didn't put up a struggle. We didn't ask the questions that needed to be asked. So in the state of Wyoming, they say no wells can be drilled any closer than 350 feet to a domestic water supply. So the rig you see here is 366 feet away from our water well. There's actually a rig right in the foreground. You can just see the edge of the location there that's 355 feet. And really just to the north of us, there's a well that's 100 feet within the legal setback, 246, 47 feet. So pretty soon we saw the rules didn't count for much. There was never a state inspector. We found later that a lot of times when they drilled these wells, and for instance they put the casing in the ground and cemented it, we read on the sundry that they had got an inspection from the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. We found out later on that that inspection was a phone call. They would say, we've cased this well, we've cemented it, and we would like permission to check our box and carry on. And so the inspector would say, okay. They'd check the box, the inspection was done, and work continued. So it really, really started to show that we were the ones who were going to really pay the cost for this. This is a picture looking back towards the house. There's some corn here in the foreground that's frozen down. There's actually over 200 head of cattle in the corn. The corn's so high you can't see the cows. But I wanted to give you an idea of just what it's like. If you have gas drilling come to your neighborhood, they don't give a damn how long you've been living there, or how many trees you've planted, or that your children or your grandchildren may play out there. That has just become a gas field. And that's what it is from that time forward. We had people on our place 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, making decisions on our private property that we had no control over. So in the span of a little over 4 years, we went from the 25 wells I mentioned earlier to over 200 wells. In a 4-mile radius from my home, we now have 200 active gas wells. We have 3 large compressor stations. We have a giant flare stack. And the thing is each one of these wells has its own little miniature refinery on site that separates the liquids that come up, that pumps the gas. All of these procedures, all of these functions of doing this emit emissions. There's methane emitted from the pumps. There's fluids that leak. There's the most god-awful smells that you've ever smelled in your life. But the drilling was only part of it for us, because in order to make these wells productive, they have to do the hydraulic fracturing. So this picture was also taken from our front porch. And this is looking northeast. There's a big compressor station back here. Every one of the white structures you see in the back is a production facility or a wellhead. And this is what hydraulic fracturing looked like in our part of Wyoming. That giant cloud going into the air contains, your guess is as good as mine. Thanks to George Bush and Dick Cheney, who it almost makes me sick to say those two names, they dealt in complete privacy with all the major oil and gas companies from around the world, to the exclusion of farmers' organizations, community organizations, insurance companies, health professionals, you name it. They excluded everyone, and they came up with the Energy Policy Act, which excluded the procedures of hydraulic fracturing from every major environmental law in the United States. Both laws governing our water, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Superfund Act, which governs toxic chemicals and how they're used and what sort of fines and punishment can be assessed if they're used incorrectly, and cleanup methods. This is all exempt from that. So, when they fracked the well right behind our home, and all the stuff that you saw coming out of that machine went into the air and collapsed over the top of our house, I was very concerned as to what we had been exposed to. Because immediately, your breath feels short, your eyes burn, there's a funny taste in your mouth. This didn't happen once, this happened 14 times over the period of a week. The first time it happened, I went racing up to the location in my vehicle and got out, and I was demanding answers from the man who was in charge of the location. And I got this almost blank stare, and he said, well, it's safe. Everything here is safe. Look, my own men are walking around in this, and he was right. They were walking out there, they had hard hats and coveralls on and their safety-toed shoes, and that was it. You know, it must be safe, he said. He had no more idea what they were being exposed to than what we were being exposed to. And the rules were such that these chemicals are proprietary. It's a trade secret. It's their secret formula. And you're going to hear stuff like Barry O'Farrell, who was on the radio a few days ago and said that it's the same ingredients they use in chewing gum. Well, in the United States, we had ice cream instead of chewing gum. That's what they told us. It was the same ingredients used in ice cream. Well, I can damn well assure you, if you ever opened a container of ice cream and it smelled the way this smelled, that'd be the last bowl of ice cream you ever ate in your life. This takes every idea and every concept that you may have about living in a free society where people are supposed to be equally represented and be protected from abusive government policies and corporations trying to make money, and turns it on its head. We could not find what was happening in these events. And then as we went, it only got better. This is what we wound up with. This is a map of the pavilion area. The blue dots are our water wells. We live right about here, where you can see a little bit of the green, and the red dots are gas wells. There are two things that happen in this valley. There's agriculture, which I said is primarily hay, barley for beer, sugar beets, and corn, and the raising of cattle. The only other heavy industry, if you want to call it that, is oil and gas in this valley. So that's what it looks like now. That's what 4 years of unconventional gas, and this is a small field, ladies and gentlemen. This is extremely small. This is 200 wells. There are fields in Wyoming that have one well that produces as much gas as this whole field. So we were sacrificed for nothing. And unfortunately, we were complacent enough to not ask the questions, to not be concerned when they came knocking at our door. Because that's bad enough, but things just continued. And we started to see impacts from, try the space bar, see if that'll, All right, here, modern technology. When they tell you it's perfectly safe, here's the real deal right here. My neighbors started to see real impacts to their water. My neighbor Lewis Meeks, whom, okay, here we go. This is what happened after the drilling came in. And then you live in an active gas field, right? We don't have drilling in the area anymore. It's pretty well drilled. But this is a production tank. This is right in front of the petroglyphs. Just to the right of the picture, another 35 feet, is the main irrigation canal that supplies water for all of our farm. So what happened is a gentleman pulled up in the water truck, and he hooked his hose up to that, what they call a produced water tank. And water should be nowhere in that labeling on that tank, because I can assure you it's the furthest thing from water you've ever seen. But this is an industry that deals in half-truths and cover-ups, because we have people in Pennsylvania who saw these trucks coming into the location right above their house, big tankers, and they were marked fresh water. Well, after things went horribly wrong, they found out what the industry's definition of fresh water is. That's water that's fresh to that location. Okay? So they're going to rebrand all these names for you. Fracking is a horrible word. I mean, it's a word that if I'd said when I was this tall, my mom probably would have, knocked me in the back of the head. It sounds bad. So if it sounds bad, they're going to relabel it. So produced water is a stretch. But anyways, he pumped 1,000 or 1,500 gallons into his truck, and when he left, he forgot to attach the big heavy hose, disattach it from the truck, and it pulled the fitting out of the back of the truck. So he panicked or whatever happened, and he just drove around in a couple circles until the truck was empty, and then he went home for the day. We were getting ready to move about 80 head of cattle through here to heading to another pasture, and we happened to see this. And so I take a picture of it, and I send it to the man whose job it is to oversee this out here for the Bureau of Land Management, because this is a tribal mineral rights site. And after he saw this picture and we talked on the phone, he said, well, I really don't see anything wrong here. The industry does a good job. I trust him. I really don't have time to deal with small things like this. And he hung the phone up. So I'm standing there waiting for the man from Encana Oil and Gas, the Canadian company that's responsible for this, to come and show us what they're going to do. And this water started to change color. It was black to begin with, and it stunk like acetone, like nail polish remover or diesel fuel. You can imagine that pungent, acrid chemical smell that goes right to your head. But it started to change colors as the sun shone on it. It turned kind of green and orange, and it got these big chunks in it that looked like big cheese curds. And the first guy to show up was actually a pumper, the guys who run the equipment out here. And I asked him, I said, what the hell is going on here? And he said, well, when they drilled a lot of these wells, they encountered a problem called lost circulation. Lost circulation goes like this. When you drill a gas well or an oil well, the drill bit's hollow. It's made of sections of pipe. And they use something they call drilling mud, which can contain all the chemicals that fracking fluids contain. So it can have anything from diesel fuel to salt to water to bentonite to glycols to alcohols. And it is pumped down the middle of the drill bit, and at the bottom you have a complex drill bit with cutting heads on it. This mud lubricates that drill bit and washes the cuttings away, and then they are pumped under pressure back up the outside of the drill stem, inside the hole that's being drilled, and to the surface. Lost circulation is a condition where they reach a breach in the wall and that stuff goes out into a crack in the ground. Whether that's an empty hole or an aquifer. We had spots here where they lost hundreds of barrels of mud, thousands of barrels of mud. In the United States, a barrel is 44 gallons. It's a standard big oil drum. What they do then is they throw anything they can in there, shredded paper, shredded wood, shredded tires, newspaper, anything that will go down and plug that hole up so that they can get the circulation fixed. They introduce bacteria when they do that. And it causes basically a bacterial infection in the well. You get things like iron-reducing bacteria and slime-forming bacteria. And so they dump massive amounts of biocide, which is like insecticide or herbicide to kill, microbes in the drilling mud. It also kills all the beneficial bugs in the soil. And they're using barrels of this stuff to try to kill this. And I've heard since I've been here and before I got here, and a lot of the industry people say, well, we're doing it different in Australia. We were in the Pilliga a few days ago, and we went out to one of the locations where they're drilling. And I must say that they are doing some things different than they do in the United States. They had a fence around it. We didn't have fences. You could wander onto it anytime you wanted. But one thing I saw as we walked the outside of the fence, and the SAS security guards followed us around. that there were pallets and pallets and pallets of biocide. And tucked back in the corner of the drill pad was a pit, a sump, unlined, full of fluid. These are two of the industry's biggest arguments here. That we're going to, yes, we'll use these ponds or these sumps or pits like we call them, but they're going to be lined. We're going to protect the groundwater and the soil. But back where they thought no one could see it, here's an unlined pit with an unknown fluid in it. Here's the very same chemicals that 10 years ago were stacked on the locations beside our home. So when they tell you that they're doing things differently, I'd be very, very skeptical of that. The smells were the same, the sites were the same, and unfortunately, up in the northern part of the country where this is very heavily occurring, a lot of the health impacts are starting to be the same. There's a river that has methane bubbling through it. And what did they say? It's always been that way. That's what they told us too. Your water's always been dirty. It's always been contaminated. It doesn't matter that Native Americans lived in the area for hundreds of years. It doesn't matter that there's been thriving agriculture there since the early 1900s that never saw any of these problems. That was their excuse. So, our farm fields. This picture makes me dizzy, but that's the way I took it. And this is in one of our fields. Everything is gravity flow irrigation. Everything is on a very precise grade. We run water at the high side. It runs through little channels every 30 inches and goes through and irrigates the ground. So the dog and I went down to change the irrigation water one morning. We heard this funny noise, this roiling, boiling, bubbling sound. And out about 50 feet from the pipe that we let the water out of looked like a mud pot volcano come up through the field. And this is one of the newer wells at the time. It'd only been in production about 3 years. What had happened is they call it the flow line. It's the line that comes from the wellhead, goes over to the treater equipment. It carries all the gas, all the liquid, everything that comes out of the subsurface goes through that pipe, and it had ruptured under the field. And all this crap boiled up through the ground. We got on the phone and got them out there and got the irrigation water shut off, and they dug down and fixed their pipe up, and they hauled some topsoil in, and they said it'll be fine. Well, we now have a strip about not quite as wide as the row of seats here. And this field from the top to the bottom where the water exits is about 1,100 feet. That whole strip is just dead now. So you take 220 acres of really productive ground and you start chopping strips out of it. And you start putting an acre pad here and a pipeline there. And you introduce noxious weeds. It reminds me of an old thing I heard of death by 1,000 cuts. We have seen our production drop. We have seen the introduction of weeds that we never had in the past. And this is not an uncommon occurrence in Texas, Pennsylvania, Colorado, all the places that I've seen this occurs. As I started to earlier, my friend Lewis Meeks came to me and said, "John, I think that they got my water." And they were actively drilling a well behind his house. He said, "It's starting to stink. There's something wrong." Lewis has lived there for 40 years. He worked on the Alaska pipeline. He's worked in all the industries in Wyoming. He's not your average environmentalist. This is the great equalizer. This will make you passionate about the environment you live in. This is his tap water now. That's tap water. This is a man who, for years, his place was the one where all the farm workers went in the morning to fill their canteens up before they went to work. We used to have a huge migrant workforce that came through because all the sugar beets required weeding by hand. Thousands of acres of sugar beets had to be weeded by hand. Everybody went to Lewis's house in the morning. What we now have, after the Environmental Protection Agency investigated in our area, one of the first orders that came from them or recommendations was, don't drink your water, don't cook with your water. If you shower, do dishes, or do laundry with your water, you must ventilate your home so it does not explode from the methane coming out of the tap. This is not an uncommon occurrence. This is the neighbor about 2 miles to the east. This is Jeff Locker. And he is one of my favorite people in the whole world. He's somebody that I admire, that I look up to. He's a pillar of our community. He's somebody who, no matter what, who you are, what you do, if you have a problem, this is the man that will help you solve it. They live on a former dairy farm. Dairies require very clean water to function. They had a well about 500 feet behind their home. Jeff was out in the yard working on a piece of farm equipment between his house and a big barn that he has. And his wife, Rhonda, came out and said, Jeff, there's something horribly wrong in the house. The washing machine's plugging up and something black is coming out, running out on the floor. So he ran in, they got the plumbing shut down, and sure enough, this black ooze had plugged the washer up. It was running out on the floor. And about that time, the men who had been working on the gas rig were coming through the yard because they have to drive right through their yard to get out of the location. And Jeff stopped him and said, you need to come and look at this because I think whatever you did has damaged our water. And immediately before the guy got out of the pickup, he said, there's nothing we could do to damage your water. And even after he saw the black water, they refused that anything had been done. For years after this, Jeff and Rhonda hauled water for private use, for consumption. The water would get a little clearer. They'd work on another well, the water would get black again. So finally, after years of wrangling, trying to go to the very company who said, when they moved in, that if you have a problem, if you think there's something wrong, come to us because we're a part of your community now. We're your neighbors. We're here to help. Well, this is the man that helps everybody, but now he was the one stuck with bad water. So finally they said, here's $20,000. You put in a whole house reverse osmosis system, it'll cure all your problems. So they did. Rhonda started to use the water because you go to the tap and the water looked good. But Jeff, who maintains that RO system, wasn't so sure about it because these are pre-filters he's holding. The one on that side is a new pre-filter, fresh out of the package. The one on this side is 3 days old. Rhonda began to suffer horrible health consequences. Nothing else had changed in their life. I mean, they're not drug addicts, they're not whatever you want to, they don't live a risky lifestyle. She started to suffer from a condition called neuropathy, where her extremities started to go numb. She began to suffer seizures. She began to suffer cognitive difficulties, where she couldn't think clearly anymore, where she got tired very easily, and she's now under 24-hour-a-day management for chronic pain. These are not weak people. These are not hypochondriacs. These are people who have worked hard their whole life. When the Environmental Protection Agency came in, did the testing and made the recommendations I told you about earlier, they also found out something about a reverse osmosis. While they may do a good job with dissolved minerals or salts, things like that, they don't do a damn thing for petrochemicals. So the glycols, the alcohols, the things that were in the Locker's water were actually concentrated in the water that was supposed to be clean. But now, another common thing that happens in these areas is it's up to them to prove that the water was clean to begin with. It's up to them to prove that the health impacts that Rhonda has suffered are because she's been drinking contaminated water. Now, a lot of these chemicals have no known health human studies because they're unregulated. The chemical industry introduces thousands of new chemicals every year. So when they inject all this stuff in the ground, not only do you have the unknown that they've put in there, but you squeeze it under immense pressure under the ground with the existing chemicals in the formation, and you get something called TICs, tentatively identified compounds. That's what's in our water, our own personal water. They run the water through a thing called a gas chromatograph that basically evaporates it and then takes a sample of it as it goes through a special tube. And it shows on a chart, much like an EKG, these spikes and bumps. And by that, they can decipher what chemicals are in the water. The chemicals in our water, they can only decipher down to about an 84% probability of what they think they may be. They're synthetic plastics and these weird alcohols, that one they said they've only seen 2 other times ever. So we thought finally with the EPA, we had proof of what we thought was wrong. Because we went down there and just asked them, the state and industry for 10 years has told us there's nothing wrong. Please come and look at the water. We didn't tell them we thought it was X or Y that contaminated our water. They came in and did a groundwater study, and they made the recommendations, and in the winter of 2010, they released a draft report saying there's contamination in the groundwater in the area east of Pavilion, Wyoming, and the chemicals are there because of hydraulic fracturing and improper drilling techniques. This was the shot kind of heard around the world because that had never been said before. They always stand up there and say there's never been a proven case of this impacting groundwater. And there's a good reason for that. First of all, in the United States, they own most of the government. They control what the government does. They set the rules like they did with Bush and Cheney. And then they have people like Jeff and Rhonda Locker in that same circumstance who get pushed so far that they can't buy food anymore. They can't go to the doctor anymore. They can't sell their homes because all of our property is essentially worthless now. Our own county auditor, our own county court or tax people now value our land at about 10% of what it originally was worth. So the company comes in and says, we will make a cash settlement with you. But what you're going to do is you're going to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And from here until hell freezes over, you cannot talk about the money you got, the damages you suffered, any evidence you may have belongs to us and it's locked away. There have been hundreds of cases of this in the United States. So I guess in a way they can stand up and say there's evidence. That's why this was so important. But what happened was the industry and the state of Wyoming went to war with the Environmental Protection Agency. Massive amounts of money from all the big political lobbying groups, the American National Gas Association, the Petroleum Association of Wyoming, the National Petroleum Association, made huge donations, got all their industry-friendly lawmakers to attack this. And this summer, the EPA administration gave up supervision of this investigation and turned it back to the state of Wyoming. The very state who said they didn't have the manpower, the money, the technology to do this, and said there was nothing wrong. And the governor stood in front of us, Matt Mead, the governor of Wyoming, and with a smile on his face happily announced that he was in charge of the investigation, but assured us not to worry, that Encana had generously given them $1.5 million to conduct the investigation with. So now we have a state who denies there's a problem funded by the industry that caused the problem investigating us. You have much the same situation setting itself up here. You have politicians that take donations from these corporations, that make rules that favor them, that make decisions that could destroy your water here forever, whether that be long wall coal mining or coal seam gas, or heaven forbid, the shale gas that lies under the coal seam, and most of these areas will be the next gas source that they will go to after they extract the coal seam gas. And then they make these decisions, and where do they go? They don't retire and enjoy the good work they've done for the people of Australia. They go to work for Santos or one of these other big companies. It's happened in the United States, it's happening here. Do not fall asleep in regards to these politicians. You have to hold their hand to the fire. If they do not do their job, when the elections come up, you need to toss them out on their ass and get somebody who will really represent you. And it doesn't matter what party they come from or what lie they tell you. If they're not working for you, they're not worth having. So after all this and being cast aside by the administration of the EPA, we still live in a gas field. We still have to deal day to day with the lost production. This is a pit. Now you go up to the Pilliga and there's big ponds where they're storing this water. That's what was out here in the field. This is about, almost an acre and a half. So a football field and a half of American football that the alfalfa will grow about this tall on. The rest of it's up to my knees around it. This was something they said was reclaimed 25 years ago. What has actually happened now is that because we flood irrigate, the salts and the heavy metals from this are actually moving down the field and creating a bigger problem. And then there's stuff that they're just now working on. This was 2 months ago on our place. This was a hole so big you could have put this room in there. Some of the soil was so contaminated you could take it over out of the wind and strike a match to it and the soil would burn. They also started to give us some preliminary reports. They haven't written the official report, but one of the first things in the preliminary report said that they did not encounter groundwater. Well, I walked around here every day and took pictures, and as you can clearly see in this picture, it's got about 4 foot of groundwater in the bottom of it. So there's the truth, and then there's what they say. And I'm not being sarcastic. I've dealt with this for 15 years now. And this is the industry that thinks if they tell a lie often enough, it becomes true. We also have to deal still with failing production equipment. This is right above our house. We catch about 95% of the mechanical failures in the field because we're the people that live there. We're the people who have a vested interest in this crap not blowing up and taking us with it. What you actually see coming out of there is not smoke, it's triethylene glycol, which is not really something you want evaporating into the atmosphere. And on this very location, the year before this photo was taken, there was actually a leak in a triethylene glycol line, and overnight we lost 12 calves. Dead, drop dead. This is not benign, harmless processes that we're talking about. And this has been on private land, but public land fares no better. This is the upper Green River Valley of Wyoming. This is 100 miles south of Yellowstone National Park, which Yellowstone is one of the most beautiful places in the world. It's one of the last bastions of wild country in North America that has not been screwed up. It also is home of one of the super volcanoes in the world. The volcano that if it goes pop, the rest of us are done. This is 1,800 wells. This is public ground where my dad and I and a lot of people that I grew up with, my dad trained horses. We took the horses out and used them and made real horses out of them. We used to ride out here and gather cows, and they don't even run cows here anymore. This is nothing but a giant industrialized wasteland now. And you'll hear the argument that, well, I'm here talking to you about tight sands gas because that's what's on my place. And that's right. They're all unconventional fuels, though. And I have a lot of experience with coal bed methane, which is what I've got to show you now. The Powder River Basin of Wyoming is basically the northeast corner of the state. We're a big rectangle. This is a very, very beautiful piece of the state. Rolling grasslands. This is where the buffalo herds got fat and shiny. This is where people have raised cattle for 100 years. It's also home to the biggest coal mine in North America. And about 10 or 12 years ago, it was a site of one of the first coal bed methane booms in the United States, coal seam gas. In no time at all, we had 13,000 coal bed methane wells in the Powder River Basin. So we took draws and coulees where the pioneers had planted trees 120 years ago when they came to stop the wind or block the wind that blows incessantly here. These ephemeral draws that might see standing water once a year when we have a big thunderstorm come through, and they started dumping all this water on the ground because in order to get the gas out of a coal seam, you have to dewater the coal vein. It's the same thing you're going to do here. If they go in for coal seam gas, the first thing you have to do is get the water out so the gas comes with it. So now we have these giant salt pans and the trees dying. It has had ruinous results for the whole corner of the state. There's people who I have the honor of knowing now that, you drive around with anybody, whether you own an acre or you own 10,000 acres, and they want to show you what belongs to them. And there's pride, and this is what I've done, and this is where we grow our crops, or this is where my grandfather built the log cabin that they lived on here. And I know some people whose family has been here since the 1880s, and the man went to drive us around and cried for 45 minutes in the truck, because this is what's become of the trees that his grandma and grandpa planted 80 years ago. This is the cost of coal bed methane in the Powder River Basin. It affects the trees, it affects the soil. Here's an average draw up there. There's the buffalo grass and the wild grass that grows in the middle. The shrubs you see are sagebrush. And this is what it looks like after you run CBM water over it for a couple of months. It's never the same. It absolutely is never the same. There are people there, much like myself now, who are facing the prospect that they are the last generation on this land. The land has been destroyed to the point where it is no longer viable for their children or their grandchildren to continue with the lifestyle and with the way of providing for themselves that they have for generations. It only gets better the higher up you get in an airplane. That's salt that's been leached out of the soil. It was proven that the scientific formulas that the state of Wyoming was using, the mathematical formulas to determine the viability of dumping this water on the ground, they would measure the content in the water of the minerals and the salinity and the conductivity, compare it with the soil, and they had a formula that they used to determine if that was viable. Now, I'll tell you, they didn't ever find anything that they determined unviable. But some mathematicians came and looked at the formula and said, you know what? Your math is wrong. This formula is incorrect. And the state had some of their scientists review it, and they agreed the formula was incorrect. And they continued to use it. Because they deemed this what the state of Wyoming calls beneficial use of the water. That is beneficial use. That has not had water run by a coal bed methane well in it for years, and it still looks this way. Because what we're looking at now, as you will see with all types of unconventional energy, is the lifespan is very short. We talked about those conventional wells in Wyoming. Some of them are nearing 100 years old. The majority of these coal bed methane wells after 10 to 12 years are gone. So what we've got now is we've seen this history of the big companies drilling the wells, reaping the initial profits, and then selling to a smaller company because it became unprofitable for them. And that company would take the next bite out of the profits. And then we have what we call stripper companies that come in, and they pick the meat from the bones, the last little bits. And when it's done, they actually pack their stuff in the middle of the night and leave. So what we have now in the Powder River Basin of Wyoming, at last count, was 3,000 abandoned coal bed methane wells, completely walked away from. That the people of Wyoming, the taxpayers, are going to have to take money out of the state budget to go back through and plug these wells. If you read the propaganda and you read the plans that the oil and gas industry has for the world, there are approximately 1.8 million oil and gas wells worldwide right now. Over the next 10 to 20 years, they want to double those number of wells. So what this really boils down to is it's not about corporate profits. It's not about politicians getting their way or telling us to go to hell and doing whatever they want after we've elected them. This is about your very human rights. It's about whether you have the right to clean water, whether you have the right to clean air, and you have the right to live free from oppression from people who seek to profit from the destruction of your environment and your future. And your biggest enemy in this is complacency. We sat by and we let this happen because we thought it was the same old with oil and gas, and I can assure you it is not. If this concerns you in the slightest, if you want your water to be safe, if you don't want to see this in the drainages around here, if you don't want to see a frac rig in your front yard, don't be silent. There are people all across Australia right now that are setting examples that the rest of the world should be proud to follow. There are people who are putting their life on the line in a very peaceful, very strong, powerful stand against this. There's a dryland farmer just yesterday in the Pilliga who locked on to a truck and held them up for most of the day because he said, well, it's very hard to take time away from my farming operations and my busy life. If I don't do this, if we don't stop this, what future do I have? This is the great equalizer. This will take all the differences amongst us, whether it's the amount of money you may make or your political views or your religious views, and all that doesn't matter. Because if you drink water or breathe air, this is what matters. We now have a proposal. You saw the Upper Green River Valley that I showed you with 1,800 wells. 40 miles to the east of us, the very same company is proposing a gas field that will have 6,000 gas wells in it. So, this is coal bed methane in the Powder River Basin of Wyoming. This is coal seam gas. You know, imagine that transposed in here with all the trees and all the lush vegetation you have. Or, if you would like to see it firsthand, if you'd like to see this in its infancy where they're really trying to get this going, get a group of people together and share expenses and take a trip to the Pilliga. Go up and stand around that location and stand there. Block everything else out and take a look at that and see what you think about that being transfixed all over Australia. And while you're there, lend your support for the day to those people who are fighting for their very existence, because it requires all Australians, it requires people from all over the world to stand up against this. I really, really admire the stand that the Australian people have taken, and I think that you have so much more to show the rest of the world, because my last slide here is a picture who really kind of struck me odd, because my mom always told me that there was a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And we had a big thunderstorm move through, and this was the picture I took. I can guarantee you for a certainty that this is what industry sees. But for us, it's been a giant pot of poison. It has really changed everything that we do, and it has affected our health in ways that we may never know. So please, if you are interested in this, there are some great community organizers. There are great groups all across Australia. You don't have to be a frontline soldier in this. Any level of support helps this. Because to sit there and think that someone else is doing it will not make this better. We all have to stand up against this. There are better ways to light our homes and better ways to heat our homes than destroying the very planet that we live on. And I commend the Australian people for the brave stand that you've taken. I'm very proud and honored that I've been asked to come and speak to you. And keep up the good work, and good luck to you all. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, John. We've now got time for probably not too many questions, because we've got to go to the other cinema and let you guys watch the two documentaries. But we are really privileged to have had John here, as you can tell. He's gone through hell and back. and hopefully that'll help us avoid it. So let's, I should transfer this microphone around so we can hear the questions. So I'll give this to Kim.
Thanks, John, very much indeed for that. Where does this rate as an electoral issue in Wyoming? And a question for Peter Martin. Is it possible, Peter, or is it being done, that a line is drawn, a photographic line is drawn with regard to the water in this area, for example, so that we have an evidentiary basis for saying that the water was pure before the fracking really gets hold?
The electoral situation in Wyoming is pretty grim, to be honest with you. It's a big state geographically. We only have a shade over 500,000 people in the whole state. Our senators, 2 senators and our House of Representative member that go to D.C. are actually in the top 20 benefactors from oil and gas contributions. We have a long history of, for instance, our last governor in his last term appointed his wife as judge in the seat that oversees most of the mineral decisions in the state of Wyoming, finished his last term of governor, and immediately went to the board of Arch Coal. Our governor right now is openly hostile to anybody who stands up. We do have some very shining examples, though, politically. Right in our area is a man named Patrick Goggles, who is from the Shoshone tribe and is a state house member, and has been a massive supporter of the people. It just takes the courage and the political will to do it. And he's not willing to be bought off. And I've met a few people in Australia that way, lawmakers that have that same courage. But it's really not that great in Wyoming.
Yeah, very a question out of left field in that respect. What about people like Annie Proulx?
Very good view, but we haven't heard much from her. You know, I think she's very wise and has good things to say and is influential, but we unfortunately have not heard much.
Very quickly on the water, we've just finished a comprehensive water study of the Sutton Forest area, which we are going to publish on the internet, everything. And we're going to send it to our protagonists, Hume Coal, etc. It's really related more to the longwall coal mining. We're fortunate, I guess, Anthony, that the gas people have been effectively run out of town, at least for now. The surface coal seam we've got is so close to the surface, doesn't have a lot of gas in it. Now the question is, will they ever come back and go deeper? We don't know at the moment. Gas is probably, in this area, a secondary issue to the longwall coal mining, but we're doing a lot to put down the evidence that in front of government, in front of the regulators, that the water is pristine, there's a huge volume of it. If they longwall coal mine or try to produce coal seam gas, they will destroy a massive area, and our computer model says about 200 square kilometres of this area from a longwall coal mine in Sutton Forest will lose its water completely. So it's very dramatic, and we didn't rig the results. So we are doing our baseline studies, if you like, to make sure that we have evidence of what was there if they ever attempt to claim that, you know, what they've done hasn't damaged it. Next question for John, please.
Hi, John. Your talk was fabulous. Thank you so much. It was so genuine. It's heartbreaking. You've sort of answered part of my question insofar as you were speaking about a Shoshone person then. You said, I think, read the petroglyphs, that it was Shoshone, Crow and Arapaho, is that right?
Correct.
Right. Are these people, or these nations, still represented within your area, and do they have any kind of different laws or acts covering, and are they part of your incredible fight with this?
They've been, the Indian tribes there, the Arapaho and the Shoshone, who are still on the reservation, the Crow are in Montana now, have been huge supporters. It's been a good relationship to build because they've been treated worse than anybody there for 150, 200 years. There are a set of rules for the Indian nations to govern water quality and air quality. It was part of a treaty in the 1870s that the state and the federal government has chosen to break that treaty. In a recent decision, however, the Environmental Protection Agency ruled in favor of the tribes, saying that they had the right to set air standard qualities in the area, including areas around the reservation, and had the right to govern those. They're now working on the water policies, but what that has done is the state, in its most recent legislative session, which is going on right now, allocated $2.2 million for legal battles against the Environmental Protection Agency and the Indian tribes to once again strip them of those rights.
Thank you. Just very quickly to finish up, was Dick Cheney your federal representative during these negotiations?
No. Dick Cheney was the House member for the state 25 or 30 years ago.
Right.
Most recently he was vice president, and I hope somewhere he's shriveling in a cave somewhere right now,
Well,
to be honest with you.
I'm sorry. You constantly hear Dick Cheney linked with Halliburton.
Yes.
I understand he still has shares.
He was the CEO of Halliburton before he was vice president. He had to step down from that for the nomination, but has extremely close ties with that industry and always has.
Okay. Thank you so much. You've been tremendous.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I've got a dumb question. I sat next to a lady who came from North Dakota, and she had, I think, oil wells on her property.
Yes.
And she said she was mad with the oil companies because they were dropping her royalties down. But forgive me, with the view of the Beverly Hillbillies, no landowner gets royalties on coal seam gas, do they?
You know, in our area, we don't get any royalties because we didn't own the mineral rights. And even the people who have owned the mineral rights, that I've seen this most widely in Pennsylvania, the companies have a way of not paying those or paying very little. If you, say, get an 8 or 10% royalty, they will assess all the production and exploration costs against that percentage of the profit that comes out. There are people in Pennsylvania that haven't received royalties for years. North Dakota is interesting with the shale oil because as they bring this really lightweight volatile oil up, a lot of gas comes with it. They have no infrastructure to handle the gas. Okay, so there's going to be vast swaths of Australia where they're going to want the Australian people to sacrifice the environment, the water and the air, to produce natural gas. In North Dakota, they burn $100 million worth of it a month just to get rid of it. At the same time that there are poor people on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation in North Dakota that are freezing to death because they can't buy propane. So this is human rights. This gets to the heart of it. And I know people who get royalty checks that say they would gladly return them if they could have their land back and their freedom back.
John, to what extent do you try and get into the minds of metropolitan people? I realise Wyoming is not a big state population-wise, etc. But it seems to me part of our problem is that whilst we're going hell for leather here, basically a lot of people in Sydney couldn't give a rat's ass. So how do we get the message across to the metropolitan people? Unfortunately, someone went and put a well in St Peters, which was wonderful. Can we drop one in St Ives and all the other suburbs? But how do we get across to the metropolitan people what's actually up for grabs here?
Well, you know, that's interesting because that's one of the ways that the state of New York has been able to achieve a fracking ban in their state is by working with the massive metropolitan areas they have in conjunction with the upstate farmers. And actually the other night at Narrowbriar, there were a group of people who drove all the way from Sydney to offer their support to the rural areas. I think what you need to do is dig a little deeper. There's the Lock the Gate Alliance. There's some of these other alliances that have organizing groups set up within Sydney, and invite them down and have a public meeting and show them what's going on. And I think that they were very willing to say that they would help. What you can tap into there is a massive weight of numbers. When you're talking about public comments and getting it out to the government, I think you just, have to be willing to kind of overlook some of the differences because, for right now, it's not going to happen around Sydney. They effectively have banned it around there. And there were people there expressing the interest that why should they have the ban while other parts of the country are being sacrificed? So I think you get with the organizers. Jeremy Buckingham was the man who sponsored my trip coming over here in conjunction with the Lock the Gate Alliance. And I think they can get the rural areas in touch with these urban groups that can really add to the overall picture of this. It's not easy because there's massive differences, but the commonalities that we have are too big to overlook, and I think that you can work together if a person really puts the effort into it.
Especially if you're talking about water.
Yes. Because you drill a well here, it doesn't just affect you or your neighbor or the backyard. It's going to affect water for hundreds of kilometers.
Well, thanks very much, John. We'll have to leave and go next door and leave you to watch the two documentaries. I think we should say thank you again to John because he's given up 3 or 4 weeks, and his wife and son are here as well in Australia, running around to all these locations in Queensland and New South Wales. He's down to Victoria tomorrow, and basically putting his shoulder to the wheel for us, which is amazing. So this is a very special guy, and I think we should all say thank you very much. And I like his hat.